In this chapter, we'll take a look at stress. More specifically, we're going to take a look at the biophysical, the psychological, and the sociological aspects of stress. So just to kind of get started here, I was just kind of giving some examples, which I'm sure you're all well acquainted with the fact that, exams in college can be very stressful, as well as even graduating from college, maybe entering the workforce and, starting to get that feeling like, hey, I'm going to be on my own. I'm not going to have the financial support of my parents. And, I need to start building my career. That can be stressful as well for some people. Okay, so we took a look at a couple examples of stress, things that can cause stress in college students' lives. Now we're going to take a look at the actual definition of stress. So one way to look at stress is this. It's negative emotional state occurring in response to events that are perceived as taxing or exceeding a person's resources or ability to cope. So what's important to remember and to kind of categorize in your thinking is the fact that I mentioned events that are perceived as exceeding a person's resources. So that is a major cause of stress. And one thing that's important in this definition too to keep in mind is I use the term perceived. So I'm going to elaborate upon that as we proceed and a little further into this discussion. So down below here, I put what's known as cognitive appraisal model of stress. And basically, what that emphasizes is the role of an individual's evaluation, their appraisal of the events and situations and of the resources available to deal with the event or situation. So basically, one's personal appraisal or an evaluation of what's going on in life is very responsible for levels of stress that one experiences. Okay, an important term that we should keep in mind is the term stressor. And stressors are events that are perceived as harmful, threatening, or challenging. So basically, a stressor is basically what is causing us stress, the things that are causing us stress. So keep in mind here that one's personal appraisal of the stressful situation is actually what is responsible for the level of stress that one experiences in regard to that. So stress is likely to result if a stressor is perceived as extremely threatening or threatening with few or no coping options available. So basically that just means, stress is likely to result, if, the situation is perceived as being very threatful, okay, or threatening, and that one might feel that they don't have the resources with which to deal with that specific situation. So we're going to talk about some of the various types of stress, the sources of stress. And first of these is traumatic events. So traumatic events, there's, basically events or situations that are negative, severe, and usually far beyond our normal expectations for everyday life or events. So things we don't experience on a regular basis. Now, down below here, right in the middle of this slide, I did mention that when traumas are intense or repeated, some psychologically vulnerable people may develop post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD. And so that's when definitely when traumas are very intense or they're repeated often. So you remember I've, previously mentioned that, one's appraisal of the situation is what's important to the level of stress within which, one experiences stress. Okay, so definitely, these are just actually a reminder right here on this slide. But keep in mind, that it's not the events themselves that are stressful, but is your response to those stresses. So you'll have noticed that within certain situations, some individuals may say, "Hey, no problem, I got this," and they actually maybe have certain coping mechanisms with which to deal with that specific scenario. Whereas other individuals, will react strongly emotionally to that, to the event or the scenario, and they might not have the coping mechanisms or strategies available with which to deal with that stress. So definitely keep in mind that is your response to stresses that is important to understanding how that your response is responsible for determining the level of stress with which you experience in regard to certain scenarios or events or situations. Now, another source of stress can just be daily hassles. Basically everyday minor events that annoy and upset people. But what is stressful about those minor events is that they might be cumulative. They happen a lot in daily life. So it can just become stressful, irritating, and one eventually becomes to, react emotionally to those daily hassles. So please pause the video and look at some of these examples I mentioned, that some of the types of events that women are likely to report as daily stressors in comparison to what men may report as their daily stressors. So some examples of daily hassles, I've listed here. And if you look at each column, you will see like daily hassles right here. So that can be, things like concern about one's weight or health, et cetera, et cetera. And then on the middle column here, college daily hassles or daily hassles that one experiences as a college student. And that can be, increased workload, class workload, things like that. Worrying about one's future, career, things like that. And then last but not least, the last column on the right-hand side here says acculturative daily hassles for children. So definitely, that just means one specific culture, the hassles that one experiences one specific culture. Okay. And so I gave a couple examples here. So please, feel free to pause and look at those on your own for further insight. Now, what researchers have determined is this right here, that as stress level increases from low to moderate, well, that can actually result in increased performance. Okay, so definitely optimal level is right here when stresses might be, kind of, right there in the middle, so it's manageable stress. But once it crosses this line right here on the lower horizontal plane right here, as stress levels start to increase, it can cross the threshold and then performance level starts to decrease. You can see that right here on the left-hand vertical side right here. That's performance level. Okay, moving forward here. Another type of stress might be work stress or burnout. So I listed a couple of the characteristics of burnout and then some of the causes of burnout, And last but not least, a possible solution. This isn't the only solution down here at the bottom, but it is just one solution. Okay, so now we're going to take a look at some of the social and cultural sources of stress. So definitely, people who live under difficult or unpleasant conditions, they tend to have very few resources and they experience chronic stress as a result. And so chronic stress is also associated with lower socioeconomic status, which can result in poorer physical health. Racism and discrimination are another important source of chronic stress. This is just a chart. Please review this. Feel free to review this on your own time. This just talks about socioeconomic status and how it might affect one's health. So taking this discussion a little further, adapting to a new culture can be stressful to individuals as well. And that is called what's known as a acculturative stress, results from the pressure of adapting to a new culture. And so on the right-hand side, in this right-hand green column right here, I talked about the different ways of reducing stress when it comes to a acculturative stress. Okay, and so please pause the video, review this on your own. I will move forward here. Okay, so right here I just kind of give two questions that individuals that are experiencing acculturative stress, that they are constantly facing in their daily lives. And those two questions are, so first and foremost, should I seek positive relations with the dominant society? And the second question they may experience is my original cultural identity of value to me, and should I try to maintain it? So these are two questions that those who are trying to adapt and acculturate might experience. Okay, so we talked about some of the basic stressors and maybe the causes of stress. Now we're going to start taking a look at some of the biophysical effects of stress. And so right here, I did say the mind and body connection. So definitely our psychological processes or our mental processes have a strong connection with our physical health. So I just put a couple notes here. So stress can indirectly affect a person's health because it may prompt them to engage in certain behaviors that jeopardize their physical well-being, such as poor dietary or poor sleeping habits. So that's definitely how stress can indirectly affect a person's health. On the other hand, stress can directly affect physical health by, altering bodily functions, leading to symptoms of illness or disease. So we will discuss this a little more in depth as we proceed. So in regard to the actual relationship between mental processes and then biophysical responses and health changes is the fight or flight response. So you remember how one actually judges or, basically views an event. One might see that event as being threatening. And if one does feel that that they do feel threatened or not, their safety is at stake, that may result in what's known as the fight or flight response in their body. And remember, that is the sympathetic nervous system starting to kind of kick in, so to speak. And so that has some certain results, and we will take a look at these a little more in depth as we proceed here. So the fight or flight response, you know, that was developed by, this was actually coined that term by Walter Cannon, and his photograph was, on the previous slide. So just kind of, if you're interested, keep that in mind. But fight or flight response, is definitely a chain of internal physical reactions that prepare people either to fight or to take flight. So basically defend themselves or start running away from the threat. And so the fight or flight response, if we were to take a look at what's down below here, it actually affects and actually facilitates, the endocrine response. So the endocrine response, definitely, the threat is perceived by the amygdala. And remember from previous neuroscientific discussions, we said the amygdala was in the limbic system part of the brain. And then that's what sends the basically the data or the neurochemical information, okay, that start to be aware that one is at risk. Okay, so proceeding here. So definitely the threat is perceived by the amygdala, and then the hypothalamus and the lower brain structures, they actually activate the sympathetic nervous system, which results in the fight or flight response. Okay, so before we proceed here, I'd like to talk a little bit more on this slide here. So the sympathetic nervous system, what that does is that actually stimulates certain hormonal types of secretions. Okay, and that's called catecholamines. Okay, those hormones are called catecholamines. And so that can be things like adrenaline or noradrenaline. So catecholamines, those trigger rapid and intense bodily changes in the fight or flight response. And this is just a little diagram right here of maybe what one might experience during the fight or flight response here. Things like pupils dilate, the heart rate increases, muscles tense, may tremble, respiration quickens, so they'll start breathing a little faster. And then last but not least, maybe perspiration begins, etc. So just preparing the body to fight or run. And this is just another little diagram right here. Feel free to pause the video here and actually look at this to gain a little more insight into this, if you're interested. All right, so definitely one thing that's important to keep in mind is prolonged stress. That produces what's known as the general adaptation syndrome. And so definitely the devastating effects of prolonged stress, they actually develop in 3 progressive stages, okay? So the actual adaptation syndrome proceeds in 3 stages right here. First of all is the state of alarm on the left-hand side right here. That's the state of alarm. That's when one becomes aware, and then arousal levels start to increase within the brain and the body. And then the body naturally proceeds to phase 2, which is known as resistance phase. And that is the body trying to actively trying to resist or adjust to the stressful situation. So basically trying to adapt, one can say. And then the final phase of this is on the far right hand side here is exhaustion. So once the first stages, they kind of um, are not successful, so to say, and one has progressed to this final level, one may experience exhaustion. So that's because their energy reserves were depleted and adaptation begins to break down. They're not able to adapt and resist any longer. So moving forward here. And this just shows you, this is just another diagram here of the adaptation syndrome are shown along this graph. So feel free to pause the video and look at this on your own time. Okay, so proceeding forward here. So we wanted to also talk about how stress affects the chromosomes, which can affect the aging process in the human being as well. And so we have, in our DNA, we have what's called telomeres. And those telomeres, they actually protect the genetic data in the chromosomes from being broken or scrambled during cell division. So as the individual ages, their telomeres get shorter as they progress throughout the lifespan. And as a result of elevated levels of stress hormones as well. So it's not just aging, it's also stress hormones that can actually affect the size and length of the telomeres. So let's take a look at the telomere. Telomeres look like this. So they are at the end right here of the chromosomes. These are the telomeres at the very end. Okay. And then on the left-hand side, this is an actual image of actual telomeres. And you can see the telomeres at the very tips. You see these little lights right here? Those are actually the telomeres. And it's kind of well known that telomeres, they're often shorter in adults who experienced trauma as children. Just something to keep in mind here, that the actual effects of stress, even at an earlier age, can affect one at later phases in their development. Okay, we're going to take a look at, well, how does stress affect the immune system? So definitely, what's important to keep in mind, is the immune system, it actually produces, white blood cells that protect our body from viruses, bacteria, and tumor cells. Okay. And then we have what's known as lymphocytes, and those, include the white blood cells that fight the viruses and other invaders. So just kind of keep that in mind. But right here, feel free to pause the video, look at this diagram on the right-hand side. All the different parts of the immune system. Now, the study of basically combining the two disciplines of neurology and immune system study, when we combine those two, that is what's known as, this is quite a long term right here, but it's Psychoneuro Immunology. I put that in red right here. Okay, so Psychoneuro Immunology. So psycho means psychology, mental processes. Neuro means brain. And then immune, or the immune system. So basically that field, psychoneuroimmunology, is concerned with how all these work together to affect one's overall health. So definitely keep in mind, one's psychological processes or mental processes and the nervous system and immune system all work together and all affect each other. Okay, this is just some examples maybe of some stressors that might affect or influence one's immune system. So please review this on at your own leisure. Okay. All right. So now we're going to move on and just start talking about, well, what are some of the things about psychological processes? And so this talks a little bit more in regard to psychological processes, but it has, like personality types. Okay. And you've probably heard these terms, like type A individuals. Those are usually individuals who are a little more intensely driven. Okay. Whereas type B individuals might be a little more laid back and relaxed. Okay. So we're going to talk about this a little bit further. So type A behavior tends to be a little more slightly, can be, this isn't a hard fast rule, but it can be slightly a little more aggressive. Okay. And so this talks about type A behavior and hostility. So, as a result of, exaggerated sense of time urgency, in a hurry to get things done, there's so much to do, that kind of thing. Trying to do more and more in less time. General sense of, anger, maybe irritation, um, which might result in, like heart disease or blood pressure, that kind of thing. All right. So then there's what's known as type B behavior. Remember I said that was the little more relaxed, laid back type behavior, or yeah, we'll just leave it at that. So type B behavior tends to be a little more laid back, maybe not associated with heart disease so much. But keep in mind, there are other things to take into account, like genetics, um, definitely the environment, that kind of thing. So there are there's more to one's overall health than just one's mental processes. Okay. All right. So I'm going to move forward here. So feel free to pause the video here, just kind of look at this and look at the circle of type A behavior. Okay, and how it can affect not only yourself, but the person that's receiving, that type of hostile behavior, and then how it transfers and it keeps circle. It becomes a vicious circle. So you might want to pause and review that. Okay. Okay. And I'm going to move forward past this slide. This isn't so important in our discussion today. Just an example, but feel free to review that on your own. All right. So now we're going to talk about some of the psychological factors that influence one's response to stress. Okay. So I did put here, first and foremost, personal control. So that's a feeling of control over the event. All right. And so that's usually the kind of talk you might hear one say, like I said a little bit earlier. They might use like, hey, no problem. I got this. I'll get through this. Going to be successful in this. I'm not going to let this beat me. I'm going to win this. So that's a sense of, like personal control. And usually, keep in mind that's because, they may feel that they have the resources and the strategies with which to deal with that certain event or scenario. Okay, so definitely, as we continue with our discussion here about some of the psychological factors that influence our response to stress, well, definitely one's emotional reaction to certain stressors is very important. So if one is, tends to experience maybe like chronic negative type emotions, so, they may actually, that might affect their overall health. Let's just leave it at that. And then, but one whose personality, they may actually tend to um, think a little more positively. That's actually associated, that positive emotions or the emotional, um, the chronic positive emotions, that tends to be associated with, a little bit better health overall, increased resistance to infection, a little less illness, that kind of thing. One's the way one inner self-talk and then one's actual external speaking style is also a factor in stress response. So that is actually what's called explanatory style. So the optimistic explanatory style, that uses external specific explanations for negative events, and which usually results in better health, stronger immune system. So basically all that means is, the fact, like a good example might be their explanatory style when they're experiencing a certain condition or scenario. They'll say, hey, it's just this. This is what's happening, and then, we'll have a specific explanations why that's happening. Okay. And say that those don't have to stay that way forever. We can overcome this. That's why this actually uses the term unstable. Okay. External, unstable, and specific explanation for negative events. Okay, now on the other hand, though, one who engages in a pessimistic explanatory style, well, they're used a little more stable, which means, their type of explanatory style might say that, hey, it's always this way. It always has been this way, and it's just always going to be this. It's always going to be this way. That is what's known as stable explanatory style, and they will basically, instead of focusing on what the actual what is the cause of the specific problem and being able to pinpoint the exact cause of what might be causing the dysfunction or the stress, they might actually say, look, it's more of a global explanation, which might mean, like, well, everybody's to fault for this. It's everybody's fault, and then maybe blaming more than one person or one cause, so to speak. And individuals who tend to engage in pessimistic style, explanatory style, that can actually negatively affect their health, possibly. Okay, so now we're just going to take a brief look at some of the social factors that affect one's health. So social support is very important. And social support just means resources that are provided by other people in times of need. So definitely it can be, I'll give you an example. Like right now, I was just watching the news and they were talking about individuals lining up or volunteering to be in lines at food banks to give food to people who are experiencing hardship, in their community or something. Well, that is social support resources. So food, is a resource. That's just an example. Okay, now down below here, I definitely give a couple examples of effects of low social support. So definitely, isolated people, socially isolated people, experience a lot of health effects, and they tend to um, experience a shorter lifespan and experience greater health problems, that kind of thing. Okay. Now, another thing that's important too in regard to social factors, but having diverse social networks, so definitely, having a lot of different, friends, family, that kind of thing, a very diverse social network, friends, family, maybe workmates, if you work in an environment that actually facilitates that. So definitely if one has a more diverse social network that is very supportive and it's been shown to lower the incidence of things like dementia and cognitive decline or cognitive loss in old age. This is just a little bit of repeat here of what I just explained here, but feel free to pause the video and look at this on your own. And so definitely we talked about some of the positive effects of social support. And so I'm going to go through a couple that I feel that is worth focusing our attention on. So first and foremost, so how can social support positively benefit one's health? So one answer to that is, well, social support can actually help us to modify our appraisal of a stressor's significance. So definitely, the more social support we have, maybe the less negatively we will appraise a certain stressor. Please pause the video and look at the rest to gain further insight into this. Okay, last but not least, before I move on, what about the negative impact of, maybe social support? Some are surprised to learn that there can actually even be maybe a negative impact when it comes to certain types of social support. So definitely, what are those things, that result in negative impact? And first and foremost, definitely negative interaction can create distress. And second, unwanted or inappropriate social support can increase stress. So if you're reaching out to offer your support to an individual that might be experiencing some distress, just kind of think about that for a moment, be aware of that, and maybe even talk to the person and say, hey, can I help you? Or would you like to talk? That kind of thing. Because if they're not in that right frame of mind or want to receive that type of attention or engage in that type of interaction, that could possibly result in increased stress for them. So on these two columns right here, I did list, some of the effective strategies for social support on the left-hand column. And then on the right-hand column, I listed some of the ineffective social support strategies. So definitely review these, and I will move on. So you might recall that earlier in this discussion, I mentioned that coping mechanisms are definitely important with in regard to how one actually judges the intensity of the certain effect or scenario or something like that. So if one is definitely armed with a lot of effective coping mechanisms, one might be able to have the resources and tools with which to get through the certain scenario a little more effectively with less negative emotional impact or physical impact. So Coping mechanisms are just behavioral and cognitive responses that are used to deal with stressors. And so definitely coping mechanisms, basically allow us to effortfully attempt to change the circumstances and our interpretation of those circumstances, and hopefully kind of move them to where we can view them to be in a little more favorable light, a little less threatening. And so when it comes to coping, there's what's known as adaptive coping. Okay, that just means realistically they evaluate the situation and then determine what can be done. So basically, here's the problem and here's the solution. And that way one can start adapting to the situation a little better, a little quicker, a little more effectively, with hopefully less impact. Another type of coping is what's known as problem-focused coping. All right. And so that is basically real similar to what I just mentioned. And that's most effective when control can be exercised. So definitely when one says, look, this is the problem. This is what's causing the problem. And so, which will hopefully, in assessing what the problem is, might psychologically sort of facilitate developing strategies with which to deal with that certain type of problem. Okay, moving on. So another type of coping is what's known as confrontive coping, and that just means facing it head on. Head on. So basically direct and assertive, but not in a hostile manner, but just saying, look, here I see a problem. I'm just going to face it head on, and I'm just going to deal with it and get through this. That's what's known as confrontive coping. So we did talk about a little bit about problem-focused coping strategies. And so that is, just having a plan, a strategy with which to deal with the situation. So that usually results by, analyzing the situation, identifying possible solutions, and then actually implementing those solutions or strategies. Real simple 3-step process. And last but not least, another type of coping strategy is what's known as emotion focused. So definitely that doesn't necessarily always mean it's negative, but more often than not, just having an emotion focused coping, where one just is really focuses strongly on one's emotions without, maybe focusing on the problem and some strategies with which to get through the problem, can sort of result in one being kind of stuck. So what I mean by that is when one feels maybe sad or scared or something, and because they may not have any other coping strategies available or other resources at their disposal, they may be stuck with just focusing on the emotional reaction to the situation. Now, please review this slide on your own time, okay, for further insight. All right. Now, this discussion would not be complete without talking about, well, okay, so how do we, what are some strategies for reducing stress, beyond, certain coping strategies and that kind of thing? So there are some definite things that have been shown to help biophysically and psychologically, even socially. So remember, we are always approaching every topic of interest and study through the biopsychosocial lens. So first and foremost, a stress reduction technique can be just getting regular exercise. And that can be almost any type of exercise, aerobic, strength training, dance, martial arts, anything like that, just physical bodily movement. Okay, the second type of stress reduction technique might be things like meditation and relaxation. And the third type might be, other strategies or pursuits like biofeedback, that kind of thing. So there are many ways to approach stress reduction. Now, please, I did include this diagram right here for those of you who want to kind of think about, like, well, what is happiness and how does one achieve maybe a sense of happiness, and what goes into creating a state of happiness. So please review this if you're interested in this. I will move on. And last but not least, I want to talk about a few suggestions about minimizing the effects of stress. Okay, so suggestion number one, so maybe minimize or even completely avoid the use of stimulants. So definitely, don't, try to avoid, let me just put it that way, try to avoid having too much caffeine or other types of stimulants, maybe tobacco or that kind of thing. Because, large quantities of those can add to stress levels. Okay, suggestion number two, we mentioned this a little earlier, but definitely engage in regular exercise. Suggestion number three, do your best to try to get enough sleep, good quality sleep. And then suggestion number four, practice relaxation or meditation on a fairly regular basis. Stopping the busy mind, so to speak. Focusing one's attention on one thing for a period of time, and enabling one's mental processes and psychological type processes to sort of kind of calm down a little bit. And feel free in our discussions and everything to definitely suggest any other types of strategies you may engage in that you found to be particularly useful. Okay, and that concludes our discussion about stress, lifestyle, and health.